The Galactic Combat Academy on Station Keth 7 had exactly 347 rules carved into its founding charter, and precisely one immutable law of physics that every single instructor taught within the first week. No species in the known galaxy could effectively dual-wield weapons in combat. This wasn't philosophy. This wasn't debate club material. This was neurological fact, as certain as gravity, as inevitable as entropy, as unchangeable as a cron's inability to understand sarcasm. The station itself orbited a purple dwarf star in neutral territory, which meant every species with enough credits and political pull could send their best and brightest to learn how to kill each other more efficiently. Democracy in action, really. The architecture reflected this noble purpose. Sterile white corridors that somehow still managed to smell like a combination of ozone, protein supplements, and the collective anxiety of 200 cadets who'd just realized their high school combat training meant absolutely nothing here. Instructor Vexthor stood at the front of Combat Theory 101, his four arms crossed in what he probably thought was an impressive display of authority. He was Quilnari, which meant he looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, given it a gym membership, covered it in burnished copper plating, and then gifted it with an ego the size of a small moon. The irony that he possessed four arms yet still couldn't dual-wield was apparently lost on him. Nature had a sense of humor. Vexthor did not. The current topic of his lecture, biological limitations and why ignoring them got you killed. A dozen species sat in the amphitheater-style classroom, arranged by size, because the architects hadn't figured out how to make furniture work for both the 3-meter-tall Dulithi and the half-meter Pixen simultaneously. At the back, trying to look invisible and failing because her species literally couldn't blend into gray walls, sat the newest addition to the class. Human. Female. 23 standard years, though who knew what that translated to in her planet's ridiculous day-night cycle. She'd arrived 14 minutes late on her first day, which already put her in Vexthor's mental file labeled problems I'll deal with later. Her name didn't matter to anyone yet. Humans were the new kids on the galactic block, only 50 years into first contact, and most species still couldn't quite believe that the galaxy's most enthusiastic species of caffeine addicts had somehow stumbled into space travel, using what amounted to controlled explosions and mathematical prayers. Earth had sent 40 cadets to the Academy this cycle. Statistically, 32 of them would wash out in the first year. The betting pools had already started. Vexthor's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his people. It looked like a threat. It was meant to be. Hemispheric integration, he announced, gesturing to the holographic brain rotating above his teaching podium. It was generic, a sort of greatest hits compilation of neural structures that most species shared. Every sentient species possesses bilateral brain structure with specialized hemispheres. One side controls logic, pattern recognition, strategic thinking. The other handles spatial awareness, creative problem-solving, instinct. A cron cadet, all chitinous plates and compound eyes, raised one serrated forelimb. Instructor, the hive minds of Sector 7 operate with distributed consciousness. How do they? The hive minds. Vexthor interrupted with the patience of someone who'd answered this question 40 times. Share processing across multiple bodies. We're discussing individual combat. Focus. The human in the back was taking notes on an actual paper notebook. Paper. Like some kind of historical reenactor. Several cadets had already noticed and exchanged the universal gesture for look at this primitive nonsense. Vexthor continued, warming to his subject. When you hold a weapon, your dominant hemisphere takes control. The other hemisphere provides support, balance, spatial awareness, threat detection. This is efficient. This is how every species fights. Single weapon, full neural commitment, maximum effectiveness. He paused for effect, which mostly just made his mandibles quiver. Attempting to wield two weapons simultaneously creates hemispheric conflict. Your brain tries to split attention, reaction time increases by 40 to 60%, fine motor control degrades, and you become, in technical terms, useless. One of the Dulithi cadets, who looked like an ambulatory boulder, with delusions of grandeur, raised a crystalline appendage. What about species with multiple limbs? The Quilnari have 4 arms. The Tenthrax have 6. Vexthor's expression managed to convey both pride and irritation. Excellent question. More limbs don't solve the problem. The neural bottleneck remains. I have 4 arms. He demonstrated by picking up 4 different objects from his desk. A stylus, a datapad, a training knife, and what appeared to be his lunch. I can manipulate 4 objects, but in combat, I can only commit to one primary weapon. The others provide support, defense, positioning. True dual-wielding, where both weapons operate as independent primary attack vectors, requires the brain to maintain 2 separate combat algorithms simultaneously. Neurologically impossible. No species has the plasticity. The human's pencil never stopped moving. Vexthor noticed but chose to interpret it as diligent note-taking rather than what it actually was. Her drawing an extremely unflattering caricature of him in the margins, with a speech bubble saying I have 4 arms and still can't multitask. This limitation, Vexthor continued, has shaped every martial tradition in galactic history. The Dualathi perfected the warhammer because their density allows single, crushing strikes. The Kron use spears because their reaction time suits thrust and withdraw tactics. The Pixan develop projectile weapons because they're too small for melee. Every species found their optimal approach within their biological constraints. He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to what he probably thought was inspirational. Your first lesson at this academy is this: know your limitations, or they'll kill you. The human muttered something under her breath. It sounded like how motivational, but with significantly more sarcasm than the translator could properly convey. Vexthor's hearing was excellent. His mandibles clicked in irritation. Cadet. Human. You have a question? Every head turned. Compound eyes, crystalline sensors, heat pits, and various other evolutionary solutions to detecting things all focused on the back row. The human looked up from her notebook with an expression of carefully constructed innocence. No question, Instructor. You disagree with established neuroscience. Wouldn't dream of it, Instructor. The translator was working overtime trying to convey the specific tone of voice that humans called technically respectful while actually being incredibly disrespectful. Most species didn't have a cultural framework for this. Vexthor did, because he dealt with humans before, and they were all like this, every single one. It was like their species had evolved specifically to be annoying. Then pay attention. We begin practical examinations next week. You'll each select your optimal weapon based on your biology. I expect you've all been reviewing the assessment materials. The class murmured agreement in 12 different languages and frequencies. The human went back to her notebook. Vexthor made a mental note to fail her on something, anything, just to maintain order. The rest of the week proceeded according to schedule. Physical conditioning in the morning, which meant watching various species attempt to navigate obstacle courses designed by committee and therefore perfectly suited to no one. Tactical theory in the afternoon, where they learned the 10,000 ways to kill each other that the galaxy had perfected over millennia. Cultural sensitivity training in the evening, which was mandatory and which everyone hated equally, creating a beautiful moment of pan-galactic unity through shared suffering. The human kept to herself mostly. She ran the obstacle courses at perfectly average speeds. She scored exactly at the median on written tests. She didn't volunteer for demonstrations and didn't ask questions. She was, in every measurable way, unremarkable. Which should have been Vexthor's first warning sign, really. Weapons Selection Day arrived with all the ceremony the Academy could muster, which meant Vexthor had actually polished his carapace, and the quartermaster had arranged the armory to look impressive rather than functional. Racks of weapons lined the walls: force pikes, plasma blades, kinetic hammers, molecular whips, and about 40 other ways to ruin someone's day. Each cadet would enter, select their weapon, and demonstrate basic competency. Simple, traditional, entirely predictable. The Kron cadet went first, choosing a 7-foot spear that crackled with energy fields, appropriate for his reach and reaction time. He performed the basic forms adequately. Vexthor approved. The Dual-Wield selected a massive hammer that would have crushed a human flat. She swung it with geological inevitability. Approved. Apixon took a precision laser rifle and immediately looked more dangerous. Approved. One by one, the cadets made the obvious choices. The weapons that suited their biology, their culture, their neurology. This was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. Then the human walked into the armory. She'd been last in line, which Vexthor had arranged deliberately. Let her watch everyone else succeed. Let her feel the pressure. Let her understand how far behind her species was. Pedagogical psychology. Totally not petty. The human walked past the projectile weapons, which surprised Vexthor. Humans loved their guns. Cultural obsession. Really. She ignored the force pikes, the plasma blades, the exotic weapons that required fine neural control. She stopped in front of the rack of training swords, basic weapons, molecular edge blades in simple straight designs, each about a meter long, weighted for balance. She picked one up, tested its weight, gave it a few experimental swings that showed she'd at least held a sword before, which put her ahead of most humans. Then she reached out and picked up a second identical sword. The armory went quiet. Vexthor's mandibles stopped mid-click. "Cadet, what are you doing?" The human turned, a sword in each hand, and her expression was perfectly neutral. "Selecting my weapons, Instructor. You're attempting to dual-wield." "Apparently. I just spent an entire week explaining why that's neurologically impossible." The human looked at the swords in her hands, then back at Vexthor, then at the swords again. "Ha! They feel pretty possible right now. Weird." Several cadets made sounds that translated roughly to, "Oh, this is going to be good," and "someone's about to die of embarrassment." The Kron was definitely laughing, though it sounded like clicking machinery. Vexthor felt his carapace heating up, which was the culinary equivalent of blood pressure rising. "Cadet, this is not a joke. Dual-wielding is not just inadvisable, it's impossible. Your brain cannot maintain two independent combat algorithms. You will fail the assessment, injure yourself, and waste everyone's time." "Cool," the human said, in a tone that suggested it was absolutely not cool, but she was done arguing. "So should I demonstrate now or?" This was it. This was the moment where Vexthor could have been merciful, could have gently guided her toward a single weapon, could have saved her the public humiliation. But Vexthor had been teaching for 40 years, and sometimes, cadets needed to learn through failure. Especially arrogant ones, especially humans. "By all means," he said, gesturing to the practice ring. "Demonstrate your ability." Combat drone, level 3. Standard engagement protocols. The quartermaster initiated the drone, and a spherical construct floated into the ring. Level 3 meant it was armed with shock batons and programmed to fight at advanced cadet competency. It wouldn't kill anyone, but it would absolutely hurt, a lot. The betting pools immediately reformed around how quickly the human would drop the swords and quit. The human stepped into the ring. She didn't take any formal stance. She just stood there, a sword in each hand, looking remarkably unconcerned about the floating ball of pain drifting toward her. The drone struck first, as programmed. A shock baton extended and swung for her head at a speed that would stun most species. The human's left sword came up and deflected it with a movement so casual it looked accidental. The drone adapted, as programmed, and swung its second baton at her midsection. Her right sword intercepted it. Both blocks had been simultaneous, entirely separate movements, independent responses. Vexthor's mandibles froze mid-click. The drone increased aggression, as programmed. Batons swung in combinations, high-low, left-right, feints, and real strikes mixed together. The human started moving, and suddenly the entire engagement shifted. Her left sword defended while her right sword attacked. Then her right defended while her left attacked. Then both attacked from different angles. Then both defended different strikes simultaneously. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how neural systems worked. But Vexthor was watching it happen, and so was everyone else, and the holographic recorder was capturing every impossible second. The human wasn't fighting like any species in the database, She fought like she had two brains operating two bodies that happened to be attached to each other. When the drone committed to a pattern, she broke it by having one sword maintain defensive position while the other exploited openings. When it adapted, she adapted differently, with each hand. The drone's programming couldn't account for an opponent that was essentially fighting as two separate entities using one body. After 90 seconds, which was approximately 80 seconds longer than anyone expected, Vex Thor stopped the match. The drone powered down. The human lowered her swords and wasn't even breathing hard. The armory was silent enough to hear the station's air recyclers humming. "You got lucky," Vex Thor said, and even he could hear how weak it sounded. The drone's programming had a glitch. Quartermaster, run diagnostics. The quartermaster, a methane-breathing Vross who communicated through a translator box, checked his systems. No glitches, Instructor. Drone performed within normal parameters. It just couldn't predict her attacks. The pattern recognition software kept expecting hemispheric dominance and didn't find it. Then the difficulty was set wrong. Level 3 is too low. It was level 3, Instructor. Verified. Vex Thor's carapace was definitely overheating now. Fine. Cadet, that was adequate for a basic demonstration. However, drones are predictable. Combat against actual opponents requires, want me to fight the other cadets? The human interrupted, still infuriatingly casual. Because I'm getting mixed messages here. First, dual wielding is impossible, now it's just adequate. Should I demonstrate more, or? Every cadet was watching Vex Thor now. This was a critical moment. If he backed down, he lost authority. If he pushed forward, he risked being wrong, which was worse. But he was Quilnari, and the Quilnari didn't retreat from challenges. "Yes," he said. "Live combat. You against." He scanned the room and picked the most appropriate opponent. Cadet Thren, Kron. Advanced melee specialist. Single sword. Thren clicked, his mandibles together in what might have been amusement or anticipation. Hard to tell with Kron. He selected a training sword from the rack and entered the ring. He was easily twice the human's mass. His chitin was natural armor, and his reaction time was among the fastest in class. The human just shrugged and raised her two swords. The match began. Thren opened with a textbook overhead strike, using his height advantage and the fact that humans had relatively fragile skulls. The human's left sword deflected it outward, while her right sword came in low, aiming for his midsection. Thren had to abort a follow-up attack to block. The human pressed, and suddenly Thren was defending against attacks coming from two different angles with completely different timing. Kron were fast. Thren was faster than most, but he was designed to track and respond to one weapon, one pattern, one threat vector. The human was presenting two. When he focused on blocking her left sword, her right one scored a touch on his carapace. When he adjusted to defend his right side, her left blade tapped his shoulder. After 40 seconds, Thren backed out of the ring. "That's not normal," he said, which was the understatement of the cycle. "She fights like two people." Vex Thor was running out of explanations. "Cadet Mora. Dualathi. You're next." The Dualathi cadet was the physical opposite of the human, massive, slow, nearly indestructible. She chose a heavy training sword that she could swing with geological patience. The logic was simple. The human could have 20 swords, but if one hit from the Dualathi connected, the match ended. Except the human didn't get hit. She used both swords to redirect the Dualathi's strikes, never trying to block the full force, just deflecting angles. And while she did that, she scored touch after touch on gaps in the Dualathi's stance. It was like watching someone fight a mountain by convincing it to miss while poking it repeatedly with sticks. Mora yielded after 2 minutes, frustrated and confused. "How is she everywhere at once?" "She's not," Vex Thor said, but he was saying it to convince himself now. "She's simply fast. Fast enough to be in two places simultaneously." "No. This is something else." Vex Thor needed data. Hard data. The kind that would explain this. "Quartermaster, I need a neural scanner. Real-time brain activity monitoring." The quartermaster looked dubious. "During combat? That's..." "Instructor, that's not standard procedure." Neither is this. Set it up. 10 minutes later, the human was wearing a neural scanner band around her head while facing her fourth opponent. The scanner fed data to a holographic display that every cadet could see: brain activity, neural pathways, hemisphere engagement, all the biological data that should confirm Vexthor's worldview. The match began. The human engaged. And the scanner showed something that made the Academy's chief medical officer, who'd been called in to interpret, make a sound of complete biological confusion. Both hemispheres were working in combat, not supporting each other, not taking turns. Actually working simultaneously on separate combat problems. The left hemisphere was controlling the left sword and processing threats on the left side. The right hemisphere was controlling the right sword and processing threats on the right side. They were sharing just enough information to avoid hitting each other, but otherwise operating as independent systems. That's not possible, the medical officer said. The corpus callosum can't handle that much inter-hemisphere communication without creating lag. She should be slower, not faster. And yet, the human said, scoring another touch on her opponent while having this conversation, here we are. Vexthor stopped the match. The armory was in chaos. Cadets arguing, the medical officer running more scans, the quartermaster checking and rechecking his equipment. And in the center of it all, the human just stood there, with her two swords, looking like someone who'd proven an extremely obvious point and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Explain, Vexthor demanded. Explain how you're doing this. The human set down one sword and picked up her notebook. She flipped to a page full of sketches. Historical images. Human warriors from her planet's past. She showed Vexthor a picture of a human in metal armor holding two swords, then another with two axes, then ones with sword and dagger, then paired sticks. Then how far back does this go? Vexthor asked. In documented history. About 4,000 years. Before that, probably longer, but we stopped writing things down when we were too busy hitting each other with rocks and sticks. The medical officer was scanning through his database. Human history shows continuous tool use, with both hands for manipulating objects. Ambidextrous development is encouraged in your cultures. Not specifically encouraged, the human said. But not discouraged either. We write with one hand, sure, but we eat with both, we manipulate tools with both, we throw with both. And yeah, we've been fighting with two weapons for our entire documented history. It's not exotic, it's just normal for us. Vexthor's worldview was cracking. But the hemispheric conflict, the neural bottleneck, every species specialized. The human interrupted, and there was an edge to her voice now. You all evolved to be really, really good at specific things. The Kron got fast. The Dualathi got strong and tough. The Quilnari got extra limbs. You all optimized. She gestured at herself. We didn't. Humans are mediocre at everything. We're not the fastest, not the strongest, not the toughest. We don't have natural weapons or armor. We compensate by being adaptable. Our brain stayed plastic because we needed to learn 50 different skills just to survive on Earth. And one of those skills was using both hands independently. The medical officer was nodding slowly. Bilateral independence developed because your species needed versatility over specialization. Your neural structure never committed to hemispheric dominance because your environment punished specialization. We're the jacks of all trades that evolution forgot to optimize, the human said, which means we're worse at everything than you all are at your specific thing. But we can do two things simultaneously. Two mediocre things is still better than one thing when you're fighting someone who only expects one thing. Vexthor felt something he hadn't felt in 40 years of teaching. Intellectually outmaneuvered. So when I said dual-wielding was neurologically impossible, you meant for every species you'd ever studied, the human finished. Which didn't include humans really testing this, because we've only been here for 50 years, and mostly you all assumed we were too primitive to bother. She picked up both swords again. Want me to keep demonstrating, or can we agree that impossible might need an asterisk? The armory was still silent. Every cadet was recalculating their assumptions. The medical officer was already writing notes, for what would probably become a dozen research papers. The quartermaster was checking whether he needed to order more dual-wielding practice weapons. Vex Thor made a decision. Cadet, you passed the weapons assessment, obviously. His mandibles clicked in something that might have been respect or might have been irritation. Possibly both. However, you will note that dual-wielding still represents a significant learning curve that most species cannot accomplish. You are an exception, not a rule. Oh, totally. The human agreed. I'm not saying everyone should do this. I'm saying that maybe impossible is a strong word when you haven't actually tested every species yet. Point taken. Vex Thor turned to address the entire class. This is why we run practical assessments. Theoretical knowledge must be tested against reality. Occasionally, reality has a sense of humor. Class dismissed. The cadets filed out, buzzing with conversation in a dozen languages. The human was last to leave, stopping at the door. Instructor? One more thing. Vex Thor was tired. So tired. Yes, cadet. That thing you said about knowing your limitations. Still good advice. Knowing them means you know which ones are real and which ones are just assumptions everyone made because it was easier than checking. She left. Vex Thor stood alone in the armory, surrounded by weapons that suddenly seemed less certain than they had that morning. The quartermaster approached cautiously. Instructor, should I update the training curriculum? Vex Thor looked at the rack of dual weapons. Yes. Add a section on human dual-wielding techniques. Make it optional for other species, but mandatory for humans. And note in the documentation that neurological impossibility requires more rigorous definition going forward. Should we inform the other academy branches? Absolutely. They're going to love this. Vex Thor's mandibles clicked in what was definitely amusement this time. 40,000 years of galactic martial tradition, and humans show up with "Have you tried using both hands?" Humbling. 3 months later, the Academy's combat manual underwent its first major revision in 300 years. Chapter 7, previously titled Biological Limitations and Optimal Weapon Selection, was retitled Biological Limitations and Optimal Weapon Selection with species-specific exceptions. The human cadet's demonstration had been uploaded to the tactical database. 40 other Academy branches requested copies. 3 xenobiology institutes requested her DNA sample, which she declined on grounds of "that's creepy" and no. Vex Thor's Combat Theory 101 now included a practical demonstration where the human cadet showed dual-wielding techniques while Vex Thor explained why this worked for humans and remained effectively impossible for most other species. It was educational. It was humbling. It was making Vex Thor reconsider approximately 40 years of assumptions. Other species tried, of course. The Kron could sort of manage it if they slowed down significantly. The Pixan gave up immediately. The Dulathi tried and accidentally smashed both weapons together hard enough to crack them. But the humans, all 40 humans at the Academy, could do it to varying degrees. Some better than others, but all of them could maintain bilateral combat independence that made the combat simulators recalibrate their difficulty settings. The human who'd started all this was now assisting in training demonstrations, showing techniques that had been considered theoretically impossible 3 months ago. She'd stopped being the human and started being Cadet Rodriguez, which suggested she'd earned enough respect that people bothered learning her name. Vex Thor found her in the practice ring one evening, working through forms with her 2 swords. He watched for a moment, observing the fluid transitions that still looked wrong to his 4-armed, single-weapon-oriented brain. Cadet Rodriguez. A question. She stopped mid-form. Instructor, when you first picked up those 2 swords, did you know this would work, or were you simply being obstinate? Rodriguez considered this. Honestly, 60% sure it would work, 40% just wanted to see your face when I tried. That mandible click thing you do is hilarious when you're confused. Vex Thor's mandibles clicked involuntarily. Rodriguez grinned. But yes, she continued, I knew it would work. Humans have been doing this for millennia. We didn't stop just because we got to space. Seemed weird that everyone here was so certain it was impossible when we'd never actually tested it. The scientific method requires testing assumptions, Vexthor acknowledged. We failed to test this one because the evidence from every other species suggested it was universal law. Every other species you'd studied, Rodriguez corrected. Which is the problem with universal laws? Universe is big. Lots of exceptions out there waiting to be found. Philosophical, for a combat cadet. I contain multitudes. Also, I'm mediocre at philosophy, so it balances out. Vexthor's mandibles clicked in amusement. Your species is going to be interesting for the galaxy. Frustrating, but interesting. We try. It's kind of our thing. Rodriguez went back to her forms. Vexthor watched for another moment, then left her to it. He had curriculum updates to write, equipment orders to place, and an entire career's worth of assumptions to reconsider. The galaxy, he reflected, had gotten significantly more complicated the moment humanity joined it. They were weak by galactic standards, slow by most measurements, lacking in natural defenses or weapons. But they were adaptable in ways that specialized species had forgotten was possible. They did everything adequately, which meant they could do anything at all. Vexthor returned to his office and opened the Academy's founding charter. Rule 347 read, all combat doctrine must be grounded in verified biological principles applicable to all known species. He added a footnote, except when it's not. Test your assumptions. The universe doesn't care about your theorems. Somewhere in the station, a human cadet was dual-wielding swords in defiance of 40,000 years of established science, and the galaxy was quietly updating its textbooks to include an asterisk that read, neurologically impossible for most species. Humans accepted. Because of course they are. The universe, as it turned out, had been waiting 4 billion years to deliver that particular punchline. Humanity had just been the setup it needed,